Hello, my name is David Thorpe, and I'm the community manager of Sustainable Cities Collective, the foremost website for leading urban thinkers everywhere. Now, you know the saying, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Well, Mayor Bloomberg's tenure in office in New York is about to come to an end, and the new ebook tells the amazing, predominantly untold story of how Bloomberg, his staff, and other city leaders put in place hundreds of measures to safeguard New York City from the effects of climate change. Perhaps those who criticised him when in office will change their story after they read this book, which is called Bloomberg's Hidden Legacy, Climate Change and the Future of New York City. I am joined today by one of the authors of this book, Maria Gallucci. Hello, Maria.
Hi, David. How are you?
And the story begins with, in fact, a survey of land use in New York City. And do you think that this emerged as a fundamental starting point? Because it's really interesting that land use should be seen as connected to climate change.
Well, certainly there were environmental groups, climate scientists within the city who were clamoring for a plan from the get-go, but it was really when the Bloomberg administration decided to look at how to develop sort of more smartly for the future that it began to make the connection. In 2005, the city's demographers came out with these projections that said 1 million more New Yorkers would probably live, or 1 million more people would probably live in New York by 2030. And at that point, the city was already strained with the 8+ million people it has. They even struggle to find places to put salt piles for when it snows. So the idea of having 1 million more people was very daunting. And so they looked at what could we do to make the city better, more adaptable, sort of more livable for people. And they realized that a lot of the steps that they were starting to take kind of really meshed well with this idea of sustainability, of conserving natural resources, of using, what you have better, more smartly, providing New Yorkers a chance to ride their bike, for instance, produce their own power locally. And through that, then they realized a lot of the work that they were doing also pertained, or related to this idea of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also related to this idea of protecting New Yorkers from rising sea levels, from the threat of more droughts or coastal storms, and so then adaptation was kind of baked in as well. So it was really sort of this evolution. There were probably certainly folks who hoped that they had reached that conclusion much sooner, but it really started from this idea of developing New York and developing the land.
So from all of this research was born Plan NYC, which had a great many impacts in the city, some of them very visible, some of them less visible. Could you say what you think the most successful of these have been?
Sure. Well, I would say certainly one of the more visible initiatives, at least when you look at maps, is the Clean Heat campaign. In New York, about roughly 10,000 buildings, when they started this initiative several years ago, burned high sulfur heating oil. And those buildings, even though they only represented 1% of all the buildings in the city, accounted for more soot pollution than all of the cars and trucks combined. So they started working with building owners, with utilities, with private banks to say, okay, how can we get these buildings to use natural gas, to use lower sulfur blends, to use biofuels? And as a result, when you look at a map of air pollution, or air quality rather, in the city, you can see dramatically that places that were once these dark red patches are now, a light shade of orange or maybe even yellow, to indicate that they're much cleaner.
Fantastic.
And another initiative I would say that's important is the creation of the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which was modeled after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to sort of make very local, very specific climate projections for New York, and it's really New York was really the first city to do this. And what it means is that when the government or when scientists plan for how do we protect New York, how do we sort of anticipate the impacts of climate change, they can see what it'll look like very locally instead of this sort of generalization of what might happen worldwide.
Could you just briefly list a few of the other things that are more visible to inhabitants of the city, like planting trees, for instance, and gardens?
Sure, yeah. So the city launched a Million Trees NYC initiative to plant a million trees, and so far they've planted 800,000, and that's had a dramatic impact because a lot of these trees are planted along sidewalks or in these sort of tiny urban parks that so it really helps break up sort of this gray concrete landscape and add a lot of not only foliage but it provides shade in the summer. It kind of helps lower the overall temperature of the urban landscape. Then there's also the Bloomberg administration has rolled out about 300 miles of bike lanes, which is great. I use a bike myself, and you certainly feel much safer when you have your own lane to ride in, and those have been kind of winding across the waterfront. Probably the Brooklyn Bridge Park is another great example. Before the Brooklyn Bridge Park kind of faces Manhattan on the east side. And before it used to be very industrial, and parts of it still are, lots of warehouses and semi-trucks and things like that. And they've since rolled it out into this big sprawl of parks, athletic fields, bike lanes, picnic tables. It's really beautiful. But on top of that, they've also built in features that make it sort of resilient to rising sea levels or to storm surge. For instance, they've kind of built out this tidal march system on the water's edge. And we saw even during Superstorm Sandy that it helped sort of protect the immediate areas around the park from the storm surge.
Now, what this story shows is the value of many disparate groups getting together and finding unity and forming public-private partnerships. But there must have been a lot of opposition from industry, the private sector, on the basis of cost.
Certainly there was, and that was I suppose one of the good things that come out of all of these groups getting together is that, there were cost concerns and even sort of technical concerns that, government or public officials wanted the industry to do things that they saw as complicated or burdensome. And his sort of leadership, I suppose, or his sort of participation in the process is really what helped get some of these laws passed because, in his words, he saw that short-term problems like the credit crunch or the inability to get loans shouldn't dictate sort of the terms of a long-term policy. That certainly, hopefully, the economy would rebound eventually and people could start to put these programs into place. But to your point about bringing groups together, I think that certainly helped that it wasn't that those industries had a seat at the table as well, that they had a chance to voice their concerns and in some cases, kind of help establish a compromise.
Now, it's about a year now since Hurricane Sandy devastated New York City. To what extent was that a defining moment in in Bloomberg's campaign to do something about climate change and bring it to the top of the agenda?
Yeah, so before Superstorm Sandy, most of the climate-related measures the city was taking had to do with mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, things like that. So when Sandy hit, it really was a wake-up call to say, okay, we've been considering projects for adaptation or maybe rolling out smaller measures, but we really need to do something big and related to adaptation, which was kind of one of the smaller parts of the climate push. And it also, so it not only sort of gave the Bloomberg administration this wake-up call, but it gave them New Yorkers were clamoring for this kind of action. They, thousands of people were out of a home. They saw what, the threats of climate change could do to their homes. And so that gave the Bloomberg administration a lot of political clout to come out and say, we're going to do these, we're going to propose at least these ambitious, really costly long-term projects that maybe a year ago, or rather a year before Sandy, would have received a lot of pushback or negativity, and now they could do this.
Bloomberg's been criticised also, though, hasn't he, for supporting development on waterfronts that are vulnerable to rising sea levels from climate change. What's been the response to that?
Yeah, that's a very active and tricky conversation in New York because the Bloomberg administration believes that you can develop the waterfront. You just have to do it in a smart way, in a way that anticipates sea level rise, that anticipates storm surge. But plenty of climate scientists in the city will say that, in 100 years, we're going to have to completely abandon the waterfront. And it would be smart then, rather than put a bunch of high-rise condos on the water, think about where you could start developing so, people could sort of start shifting over time inland. So that's a very active discussion. And the waterfront's so beautiful in New York or anywhere. People want to live there. They want to spend time there. But there's a lot of concern that New York will be building a lot of property, parks and such that will just be destroyed in a few decades.
Right. So, to what extent do you think we should credit Bloomberg with all of these things, and to what extent should we credit some of the other people that you interview and perhaps the hundreds of officials who work day and night from the evidence of your story on many of these projects?
Right, that's a good point. So, while Mayor Bloomberg is certainly the face of all of this climate work, it's hundreds of people actually did the nitty-gritty day-to-day work that went into creating these plans. I would say that Mayor Bloomberg's role was really showing an interest and kind of making it a top priority in his administration. And that sort of made other people more interested or more engaged. I think that he was really, there was this impression that if the mayor thought it was important, and if he was sending his top officials out day after day to these discussions, that maybe there would be a real response.
So it's all about the value of leadership. Well, when he departs from office at the end of the year and de Blasio takes over, do you think that these initiatives will be continued? Will they be stopped? Will they be built upon by his successors? Are you optimistic?
That's really hard to say. Certainly, Bill de Blasio, the next mayor, has commended Mayor Bloomberg's plans for sustainability and resiliency. He's called them, bold blueprints, and it seems to support what they contain. But also, de Blasio has also tried to distance himself in a way from Mayor Bloomberg. Throughout his campaign, he positioned himself as the anti-Bloomberg in a way, someone who would pay more attention to the common person and, take into account the needs of every New Yorker. And throughout the campaign, climate change, sustainability, they weren't really big issues. So we haven't really heard much about what Bill de Blasio plans to do, whether he plans to continue with Mayor Bloomberg's agendas or start his own. We do know that, if Bill de Blasio were to kind of start over completely from scratch, that, climate scientists, at least other green groups, are concerned, that would create years of delay that we really can't afford if he were just to start from scratch. That would just really set New York back.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us today, Maria.
Thank you.
Bloomberg's Hidden Legacy, Climate Change and the Future of New York City by Catherine Bagley and Maria Gallucci is available from the Inside Climate website using the link at the end of this video.